Here's the history of the urbanized world. In 1900, so this is only the last 500 years, I found this graph that started with about 10,000 BC, and basically it stays at 1 to 5% for millennia. And it's essentially only in the last 500 years that this has changed. But essentially, up until 1900, the world was only about 16% urbanized. So the city was not a very big factor in 1900. Most of the world's peoples lived in some kind of rural environment. They did not live in a city. Now, if you look at that yellow, orangish line, that one is the United States. So about the same time in the United States as the rest of the world is 16%, the United States was already at 50%. So our own history and interaction with the topic of urbanization is very, very different than most of the rest of the world. So we were the first country in the world essentially to be considered an urbanized country. So the world has gone from 1900 being 16% to, in 2016, the world reached 55%. By 2030, we're going to be well over 60%, and this trend is going to continue for some time. And so there's been this massive change. If you look at, again, for the past, if you look at 10,000 years, there's been a massive change only in this latest, kind of last 5 minutes on a global scale as to how people are now operating and congregating. There's more megacities now. Of the world's 33 megacities with 10 million inhabitants or more, okay? So it has to be a city of 10 million. Look at how few are actually in the United States. What two are those? New York and LA. Those are the only two megacities in the United States. There's 2 in Europe and 2 in the United States. So when we think city, we think, modern, Western, technologically advanced, blah, 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 without realizing most of the world's cities are not in this area. So 27 of the world's global cities, the largest cities, are located in what we would call the global south. Again, if you look at these 2 buildings right here, one has grown. So in 1990, there were 10 cities around the world that are of 10 million people or more. By 2030, there's going to be 43 cities that are 10 million people or more. So even not just more people are moving to the cities, but these really large cities are amassing at a very high rate. 9 out of the 10 projected cities that are projected to become megacities between now and 2030, 9 out of 10 are in the global south. Only 1 is in the Western world. So as we think about, 1, we go on mission trips or we send people abroad, or 2, as people are coming from abroad, that whole idea of, well, they're from Africa, so they grew up in a village, or they're from this country, so they grew up in a village. More and more, we've got to end that stereotype and realize chances are, if they're from somewhere else, they're more likely to be urbanized or even to live in one of these megacities than you or I are. Here's the world's largest cities. This is 2018, and again, you see that spread happening there. So I'm just going to click through these next couple rather quickly. These are where the cities are. So you're going to notice there are 2 things going on with this map. The dots on there represent cities. So that red dot represents a city of 10 million or more. The purple one is 5 million to 10 million, and the blue one is 1 to 5 million. But then you'll notice the countries themselves have color codes. So you have individual cities that are quite large, and then you have countries that are adapting or adopting urbanization as their preferred social organization. Okay, so the United States, even in 1970, we're already in that 80 to 100% urbanized. So that tan and dark brown is the higher urbanized, and then those lighter colors are less urbanized. So you can see sub-Saharan Africa, that swath kind of right through the wide part of Africa, in 1970 is 0 to 20% urbanized. So again, urbanization is not just a Western trend. This is something that's happening globally. So that number in particular is going to change. But look at Australia. Australia is the darkest color on the map. It's one of the most urbanized, at least in 1970, one of the most urbanized countries. What is our image of the average Australian? What's that? Outback, yeah. I mean, there's one guy in particular. Right? That's not a knife. This is a knife. Right? There's that guy. And that's our whole image of what an Australian is. But because the outback is just largely, vastly uninhabited, this means you live in a city on the coast. And so, again, media kind of can warp our mind to how do we see things. So watch particularly Africa and Asia as they're going to go from much less urbanized, and they're going to join us in these darker colors. Okay, so this is 1970. There's 1990. So look at, I'm going to go back and then forward. Okay, so there's back, okay, light blue to that dark green. So they made a jump in just a couple of decades. I'm going to go back again. Look at the number of dots that grow on the map. Okay, there's 1970, 1990. There's a lot more dots in that 1 to 5 million or the 5 to 10 million. I mentioned when we went with IMB, there were about 250 people that were with our group, our cohort of people that went. And at one point, they asked the room, they said, how many of you grew up in a city of 1 million people or more? 6 of us raised our hands, and Christy and I were 2 of those 6. The rest of that group of 250, and they start talking about their towns not having a cross street, not having a stop sign in it. So how are they, I mean, they're going to go through 2 kinds of culture shock when they go to any city pretty much in the world. You know, some of these people were headed to India or headed to China. I thought they're just going to die crossing the road. They've never had to do this. Okay, so we're going to make the jump from 1990 to 2018. Again, look at the colors that are in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, and it's about to make another jump. There we go. Okay, this is 2018. We're going to jump to 2030. Now we're projecting about the future, but watch what happens in Africa and in Asia. So pretty much every region of the world is joining this category of plus 50% urbanization. Look also how few, okay, so I'm going to jump back to 1970. Okay, look at the dots really quick. Look how empty 1970 is. So 1970, 2030. The world is urbanizing, and it's urbanizing at a faster and faster rate. This relates to city growth. Where are people urbanizing more? If you look at Asia and you look at Africa, most of the urbanization growth on a global scale is happening in these 2 places, these 2 continents. Of the cities that are going to go from 1 million plus to more, 7 of these are located in Africa and 28 are in Asia. Only 1 of them is in North America. So yes, we do have large urban centers. We live in one right here. There is New York, there is LA, there's DFW, Chicago, LA. There are these places, but in terms of where the world is going, Africa is going to be an urbanized continent on the whole. There are many countries that already is that way. Same thing with Asia. So some of the world's largest cities, and I would say at this point, some of the most technologically advanced cities are no longer in the Western world. And so this is rapidly changing how things are happening throughout the world. So let's look at the purpose of cities. Again, we think, well, my family moved to this city to make money. That actually is my family's story. My family started in South Louisiana. It's mostly rice farmers there. You don't make a lot of money selling rice. And so when the oil field came in the 70s, as many people as could got jobs with the oil companies, and then people transferred out. That's why there's so many Cajuns here in Houston. When we moved to Houston in 1989, there were 5 Héberts in the phone book. Now there are pages and pages of us. You say, well, of course, you're all having 5 kids. Exactly. We're all having, right? So in South Louisiana, just for those who don't know, Hébert is like Smith. We're everywhere over there. But there are a lot of reasons why cities exist and the functions that they perform. So the first, of course, is government. Some cities function as a regional state government. Some cities function as a national government. But every city has some form of government. If you've got to go deal with anything with taxes, with tickets, with, I know this for a friend, with anything like that, you've got to deal with the city. They don't have an office way out there in the middle of nowhere. It's typically down there kind of in the business district. Education, people move to the city for education. Healthcare, here in Houston specifically, we've got one of the largest, if not the largest, health, what's the word for that? Medical center, thank you. Medical center in the country. It's larger than downtown Seattle. So our medical center is larger than downtown Seattle. I don't know if you've ever been to our medical center, but it's like a city inside a city with no parking. I say without any bitterness whatsoever. Information. Cities are a place where information converges. There's so many sources for information. So you could think of things like libraries, but there's so much human intelligence on a number of levels here in the city. Things like entertainment. Some cities exist, or some part of the city exists to provide entertainment for people. These are things you don't typically have out in the countryside as much. It's much harder to get, say, a music show. Probably any night of the week in Houston, there's quite a few music shows. And we're not really known for that. There are other cities like Austin or New York where there's a lot more of that even. Trade and industry. There is a sense where people living in close conjunction to each other, having different businesses, this creates a synergy between the two where instead of having to travel to another place to get the parts that we need to build this thing or the people who have the intelligence to help us program this thing, it's next door or it's up a floor in the same building where we work. And then finally, defense is another function of the city. Let's look at some kinds of cities. So knowing that those are the functions, let's look at how cities were formed. And once people, on the second half of the class, people are going to be sharing cities around the world, and they're going to share part of this as to why does their city exist. So one of the first kinds of cities we have are what we call crossroads. These cities were built there because they were at a natural place where two roads converged. Any guesses on where this is? Chicago, close-ish, halfway to Chicago. Kansas City. So here's an old railroad map of all the railways that came through Kansas City. In fact, actually, there's a town to the west of us called Katy, and there's the rail line that ran from MKT, Missouri, Kansas, Texas. And so they just kept the KT part, which became Katy. But the rail line actually, back in the day, so a lot of our cities in the West, we have the historic cities kind of in the Northeast, Boston, LA, New York, Chicago's still kind of in the Northwest, more Midwest, but a lot of those cities have really, really old histories. And then when you look at the Old West towns, speculators, as the railroad is heading west, as there's westward expansion in our country, speculators are buying up lands by the square, mile out there, hoping that there will be a railroad stop. And typically everywhere there was a railroad stop back in the day, there's now a town. So you have places like Kansas that just became a natural crossroads. I think in our city, that's not necessarily why we exist, but we certainly are forming that today where there is kind of a natural crossroads, particularly east to west. Blandon is going to share in another week about trafficking, but that's, our geographic location is one of the things that really promotes and kind of fertilizes human trafficking. So the next kind of city is a break of bulk city. This is city like Houston. That's actually kind of our historic existence is we were a break of bulk city. Kansas is also a break of bulk. Kansas City is also a break of bulk. So what that means is whenever a massive cargo would change hands, it has to stop somewhere. So if you're coming in on a boat, you stop in a port like Houston, it changes hands. Stuff gets offloaded, stuff gets put back on the boat. Well, also we have strong east-west routes and other kinds of things like that. So things would get stored essentially here in Houston, bulk would change hands from one to the next, and then it would move on. But you have cities like Denver. That's a historic break of bulk city also for things like the railroad and people who are heading west. But even in the modern time, if you ever take a flight to the West Coast from Houston, you're going to stop in Denver, typically, unless you're going to LA. But for most other stops headed somewhere out, in the Midwest or the far West, you're going to stop in Denver, and you see all of these plane flights converge there. And so it's a human break of bulk point now, but it's still doing the same thing. There's St. Louis. It's on the Mississippi River. Again, as people headed west, they could then take this, at the time, the superhighway of the Mississippi River and float either direction. You also see the arch there. That is the starting point for Lewis and Clark, who were tasked with finding an overland route to the Pacific. And so again, that created another natural crossroad point. Raw material and industry. You have towns like Detroit, close access to the Great Lakes, so they could ship things. The Erie Canal connected all of that. But you have things like all of the old car manufacturing. You have, again, people living in close conjunction where a dealer company could be in close conjunction to different parts manufacturers. and they can help each other. They can help each other out. A lot of our East Texas towns are kind of raw materials. We have a town called Lumberton. Guess what they make? Lumber, right? And so some towns, their name kind of says it. Their name kind of says it all. We have some towns that are built around a salt mine or a silver mine or different kind of mining towns. And so many cities exist around the world. World's highest city, Rinconada, I think it was. That one exists because, I mean, why would you live at 16,000 feet? Unless there's a gold mine right there in your town. That's a good reason to live there. Next kind is a military city. These are forts. So again, our story of urbanization in the United States, as westward expansion happened, you have all of these fort towns. Can anybody name a fort town in the West? Fort Collins, Fort Laramie. Fort what?
Fort California.
Okay. That's too far out of my my mental map. We have Fort Stockton here in Texas, Fort Worth. So all of these towns began as a military stop. We're not the only people to do this. This right here, this is the Blue City in Rajasthan. Here is, I'm probably going to say this wrong, Fort Bertin in the Netherlands. Kind of a cool little, I'm sure they have like Airbnbs there now. But you can see the design of this city is, like this city existed at its time primarily just to be defensive. It has a moat and it's got a wall. I assume back in the day they probably had some guns up on the wall. But these were great ways to stay safe. Entertainment, can anybody mention an entertainment city? Las Vegas. What about Branson? Yeah, a little less glamorous than Vegas. But live your dream, Michael. Nobody... Also know your limits. That's good. Someone was talking about Sin City, Las Vegas this morning in Sunday school, and I said, "Hey, I don't know what you were doing there, but I mean, we were out prayer walking." Another entertainment city. Here's Rome. Right. So even some of these ancient cities. Here's the Colosseum. This is a gruesome form of entertainment, watching gladiators and all that kind of stuff, but it was entertainment nonetheless. This was what they would do for sport. So there are cities that exist purely as entertainment. You might be less familiar with this next town, Bahrain. Bahrain is in the Arab Peninsula, and essentially it's where really devout Saudis will go to party, because you don't want to party in Saudi, because that's God's country. But outside of Saudi, anything goes. Dubai kind of exists this way. As a bit of a party city. It's one of the most disorienting places I've been, because having lived in the Middle East where everything's really strict and conservative, then you go to Dubai and there's clubs on the top of every single hotel. And I heard a comedian tell this joke, but he was talking about being in Dubai, and he's like, I hear the call to prayer. He imitates the call to prayer. He goes, and then at the same time I hear, unch, 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 unch. He's like, I'm so confused. Do I go pray? Do I go dance? Right? And it creates this kind of weird convergence of both, strong religious ideology with dance ideology. So there's all these cities that exist, or at least part of cities that exist for entertainment. What about religious or education? Can anybody name a religious city around the world? Vatican?
Harvard.
Jerusalem? Yeah, Jerusalem. What'd you say? Harvard? Yeah, Harvard's a college town. Yeah. Yeah, there's Edinburgh. They got a big university there. There's Jerusalem. This is Timbuktu. Timbuktu, people talk about, just mention that to be a far place. This is West Africa. But they were a town because out of this part of the world, wherever you find water, you'll find a town. And so there's water there. But they also started schools. So they're very famous in the ancient Islamic world as being very strong in education. And so they exist because there's education. We have places like, anybody know that one? You could say this was the Mecca of holy cities. Is it Mecca? Yeah. See what I did there? All right, how about this one? Salt Lake City, very good. Yeah. All right. This is Chichen Itza in Mexico, in the Yucatan. So again, even thinking this is not just an American phenomena that here's how our cities are divided up or categorized. This happens all around the world, and there are cities in Tibet that are holy sites for Tibetan Buddhism. There are cities around the world that have these kind of religious and educational functions. Next kind would be government. There's a picture of Athens, very historic site. This is Brasileia, which is in Brazil. This city has a unique backstory. A city I'll talk about in a moment is called a primate city. But this exists because Brazil is trying to get away from primate cities. And so they're trying to spread out their urban density some. So they created Brasileia with large green spaces. So that's their Congress building in the back. Anybody know this one? Moscow? How about that one? So I had a one-day layover in Beijing, and I said, if there's only one thing I can see, I want to see this. But now it's a museum, and I happen to be there on a Monday, and museums are closed on Mondays. I tried playing the dumb American tourist, and the gate was open, and I saw two guards. I thought, man, I'll just kind of wander over there and act like I'm looking up at all the stuff, and I don't notice that, and I could just feel them coming to cut me off, and they both had big guns, and I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, I just want to step right there and take a picture, and they're like, no. Yes, sir. So primate cities, this might be a new term for you, and this is certainly not part of the American urban experience. We don't have this kind of phenomena happening, but essentially a primate city is where a significant portion of your country's population lives, or at least the regional population lives. I think probably the closest thing we would have to this would be New York. So here's a town, Rio. Rio is the smaller of two of Brazil's largest cities. The other one is Sao Paulo. 20% of Brazilians live in either Rio or Sao Paulo. Does anybody know this town? Cairo. Very good. This is taken off our balcony. I'm just joking. It's not. I wish it was. But Cairo, 30% of the population lives, 30% of the entire country's population lives in that one city. So just imagine how packed, imagine how centralized the government is. They're talking about building a new Cairo kind of out in the desert and expanding things out that way. It's probably never going to take effect, but they think it will. But Cairo is, in fact, Egyptians will talk about, I'm going to Egypt, and they mean I'm going to Cairo. And then when they go home, they talk about Egypt and my hometown, or my land, sometimes they'll say. Baladi, that's my land. So they'll say, like my land is over here, and it might be, like for us, it'd be like Conroe. And then they would call Houston, Texas. So I'm going to go to Texas, and then I'm going to go back to my country. It's just a neighboring town. But primate cities hold that kind of effect in the minds of that country. And so again, this is not at all part of our urban experience to have primate cities, but in many countries around the world, the majority of the people live in this one city. So here's cities in historic perspective. Jericho is not just the lowest city in the world, it's actually, anthropologists, even secular anthropologists agree, or archaeologists rather, agree that this is the world's oldest city. And so it dates to about 8,000 BC. They've dug down there into the ruins, and there's been several cities built on top of that, obviously, and some cities destroyed on top of that. But that's kind of where cities started. And so some of these ancient cities, they did not have much going on. Again, if you think out 10,000 years ago, there's not that many people. Even if you read that passage, from Jonah about the Ninevites, it references 120,000 people. That's not really a lot by today's standard. That's kind of like Sugar Land. It's a lot of people, but by a large city scale, that's not very large. But as you move forward in time, one of the developments in cities is the medieval period. And so there's this little town named Carcassonne. There's actually a game, I know my kids just lit up because there's a game we play called Carcassonne. It actually looks like that, doesn't it? Right? So it has little map puzzle pieces. But you can see, this is built as a fort, very defensive city. It's kind of on a hill. It's got It has the convergence of some rivers that come in around the town. It has 2 walls. You can see that. It's pretty good. If 1 wall is good, 2 is better. But there's something interesting about the design of medieval cities. This actually impacts the design of South American cities, believe it or not. But here's kind of an aerial view of that. If you look at the building in the middle, you can see a slight cruciform building. So our church is not cruciform. Baptists don't really get excited about that. But if you're from any kind of higher church denomination, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Catholic in particular, all their buildings are cruciform, which means if you look at them from the air, the way that the sanctuary is oriented, there's a long hall connected with a shorter side hall, and so it has kind of wings off of the main sanctuary. So from the air, it looks like a cross. And all of the function of Eucharist, Lord's Supper, any kind of those things are happening right there in the center of the cross. So look at this town. What is the message that having your church in the middle, geographic middle, what is the message that this sends? It's important. This is central. Obviously, in medieval Europe, their mind on how the world works is there's God, there's the church, there are kings and nobles, there's commoners, and then there's animals. And so this is sort of their understanding of the world. And so their cities are focused around this. Again, not just a European function. Many Islamic cities have the mosque at the center with the largest square, and then everything builds out from there with a big wall that goes around it. Now, how is it that this model of city can be seen also in Latin America? If you remember, the conquistadors who brought this over, they are coming from Europe. So this is particularly for all the old cities, this is the European tradition for a city. The church is at the center, and then everything else expands outward. So you go to pretty much any Latin American city that was built by the colonizers, and it's going to follow a very similar pattern. There will be some main cathedral in the main city square, and then out from that, the rest of the city goes out. So this is a very common city design for that standpoint. One thing that happened that led to high rates of urbanization is the Industrial Revolution. So as the Industrial Revolution hit the farmland, fewer people were needed to farm the land. So used to, farmers would need large families and kind of all hands on deck to help do the tilling of the soil and planting and harvest and all of this. It was just constant work. Well, now that you have things like the tractor, and you have harvest machines, and you have machines that will then process it, and everything's been mechanized, you need fewer and fewer people. Also, if you have a more individualized mindset, land gets divided enough, and at some point you have too small a piece of land to farm and make a living. And so this pushes people off and it pulls them into the city. At the same time, you have lots of mechanization hitting the city, and through that mechanization, people are able to find jobs in the factory. And so here's a picture of London. These are 2 different pictures of London. And this depicts kind of how bleak industrialization was in a town like London. This is true in American cities as well. Pittsburgh, Detroit, a lot of towns like this where the Industrial Revolution hit had mass pollution, had overcrowding. When disease would hit, it would just, because now everyone is collected up and they haven't developed. I mean, today we have lots of really great sanitation, so we're drinking clean water now. We're disposing of our garbage in an orderly and processed way. But imagine for a moment if just one of those functions of the city quit working. I mean, imagine if all of the garbage pickup stopped for a week.
Like it has in Houston.
Yeah, like it has in Houston. It gets bad. It stacks up. I mean, there's nowhere for this stuff to go. During the revolution in Cairo, this actually happened. Now remember, Cairo is about 20 million people. So if you ever go to New York, Manhattan Island has about 8 million people, a mere 8 million people. 4 miles wide, 12 miles long. All 5 boroughs have about 18 million people. So Cairo is if you took all 5 boroughs and pushed them onto Manhattan Island, that is Cairo. Now imagine that trash services don't pick up for 1 day, not to mention multiple weeks. It just starts piling up, then people start burning it in the street, and it just, it spirals out. So in the Industrial Revolution, they did not have sort of the modern organized structure that we're using in our cities today to keep them clean and to keep the pollution down. And I know everybody's always griping about that here, but to see it during the Industrial Revolution, it's a very different element. This other portrait is showing some of the poverty, and this factors into certain writers of the time. You've got Dickens, who talks a lot about poverty in London at this time. There's a song I meant to bring my guitar. I was going to sing it for you, but I'll have to do that another day. That's actually written about kind of the sad state of affairs in the city back then. So all of this is kind of its sociological side, but I want to start pushing us towards understanding its missional impact. So what are the challenges to the church in the city? In general, evangelical churches don't fare that well in the city. I think most of you probably know who Timothy Keller is. He went to plant his church, and he is evangelical. And by that, what I mean, he believes the Bible. So there are many churches that are very, very liberal and have thrown out, the historical nature of Christ or these kind of things, and that does not apply to Keller. And so he's deep into New York City, wanting to plant a church with younger people. I mean, this is the hardest of the hardest of the hardest group to think, I bet a really strong evangelical church would work with this crowd. And everybody told me it was crazy. Obviously, it's been hugely successful. But apart from a few shining examples like that, by and large, the churches in the city don't fare well. If they are faring well, they tend to have just kind of moved into being the social gospel and only focused on social programs. And so, in my opinion, they kind of have ceased to be a church. But these are the challenges. One is overcrowding. So as the cities become larger, and again, you might think about Houston and feel like you're cramped in with your neighbors and such, but imagine Manhattan Island. I mean, 8 million people. Put 8 million people inside the 610 loop. That's about the same landmass we're talking. So overcrowding is an issue. So part of this is people don't want to live in the city because of these issues. Things like quality of life goes down. But density and quality of life, these lead to other problems. These lead to things like safety hazards, health hazards, educational problems as the system becomes strained. We felt this a little bit in Houston after Katrina, when we overnight absorbed 150,000 people. And every one of our kind of social structures, our police, our fire, our health and safety, our education systems was kind of stretched to, 150,000 people, that's a good sized town. And we're bigger, but that's a lot to absorb overnight. And everybody was scrambling to try to figure that out. How do we do that? So being in a city means that whatever impacts you impacts a lot of you in a big, big way. So things like the quality of life can really be hampered, and because of that, people don't want to live in the city. If you have, say 5 kids, you don't want to live in a 1,000 square foot flat in downtown. There's just not much that you can do but break the house. And then that leads to bad quality of life for the children. But these issues are why people don't want to go into the city. So on the one hand, from a church standpoint or a theological standpoint, we often have theorized the cities are evil, we need to protect ourselves and stay out of them. And then you start looking at all the social things and we say, well, that's really not desirable. I know we talk a lot about social gospel and prosperity gospel, and it's easy and quick to bust on those people. And while I'm not hailing those, I like to point out that for many of us, we have achieved what prosperity gospel is about. And so it's very cheap for us to be against prosperity gospel when we're essentially living some version of it. And so most of us aren't ready to give up a house in the suburbs or aren't ready to give up, our vehicles or whatever in order to live somewhere that is less than our standard of living. At the same time, I admit prosperity gospel is wrong, but we also have to kind of do an inventory of our own values and lifestyle and go, okay, how much am I really embracing in my lifestyle, embracing prosperity gospel while verbally saying it's an incorrect theology. But the reality is people seek out good quality of living. This was the transformation that happened in Alief in particular as the neighborhood became transitional and as it became more dangerous and as the school systems were under some strain and everything else, there was a reason to leave this area and go somewhere else. And so very few people are moving into Alief, are moving into these school districts, or it's always an outward kind of thing. Busyness is another is another issue. People come to the city to work. That's certainly why you're here in Houston. You're not here for our weather. So people come here because we have low cost of living, high paying jobs. But this is kind of true of every city. But as you think about immigration in the city and people who are coming in from outside the country, a lot of times taking lower end jobs, many people are working more than one job or working lots of more than regular hours at their one job, or sometimes both spouses are working multiple jobs. There's a lot of these very interesting financial arrangements that it takes to make urban living work. Obviously, this is a challenge. We plan our VBS in the evening time because if we plan it in the daytime, that's not going to work in our culture. Probably 50 years ago in A-Leaf, we could have planned it in the daytime and you would have had plenty of people to work the VBS. But our local culture has changed, and so we've had to adapt as well. There's a convergence of world religions. So it's not just like reaching out to people that are like you anymore. I mean, within walking distance of this building right here, there's another building that has 14 different idols in it. And so, for the animism class, I tried to get people to go over there and go visit that because I wanted everyone to see it and to be aware. But the reality is there's all kinds of idolatry. During the animism class, we went and we visited the yerberias, which sell the herb, candles, water, oils, go down the list of trinkets that is used in voodoo, Santeria, different Afro-Caribbean religions. These things are all around us, and it's a challenge because it's not like we can go knock on doors in our neighborhood and their basic assumption is, well, which church should I go to on Sunday? Their assumption is, am I working this Sunday? Am I a practitioner of another religion this Sunday? Am I just one of the people that's basically secularized and just wants to have a good quality of life and could care less about any religion, no matter whose it is? There are so many other options now. Another thing is that it creates this sense of relativity. When there are multiple religions in the city, part of it is we have to learn to get along, but that turns into a truth statement after a while on, well, I mean, as long as you've got your thing and I've got my thing, we're all fine. And that's certainly a cultural attitude that's prevalent in our society. But this is one of the challenges to being a strong Bible-based evangelical church in the city. It's also one of the opportunities, but it's definitely one of the challenges. Heightened social problems. Cities act as amplifiers. When I say what is Las Vegas known for, I mean, we could all shout out something about Las Vegas, and our answers would probably fit within a certain parameter of each other. If I were to ask, what is San Francisco known for? Again, whatever that stereotype is in our mind, we could fit these, they would all fit within a certain parameter. Why? Is it because everyone in San Francisco is that way or everyone in Las Vegas is that way? No. It's because when you're in a city, the few can very easily have a megaphone. And the city acts like a megaphone. And so there's heightened social problems. So, you've got racists in every area in our country, or in any country around the world for that matter. But when they get gathered up in a city, all of a sudden, that has a megaphone. It's not just some random guy out in the country who doesn't like people that are not like him. Fine, he can stay on his 100 acres and not have to ever bump into anybody not like him. But in the city, these two different groups are put together. And then he's able to find people who are like him, and all of a sudden, there's traction to social movements. And so anything that happens in the city gets heightened. If there's poverty in the city, it's not just a little bit and random. All of a sudden, it collects up, it gathers up, it hits impact. If you, critical mass. If you drive around this area, especially around a holiday, you will see a lot of people on the corners with signs. And in my mind, I mean, I've never held a sign on a corner, but in my mind, you'd kind of want your own corner. And at a certain point, you realize the corners are getting so crowded. And I've even seen some people kind of duking it out a little bit over, whose corner it is. But a little problem or a little social stress becomes a much greater and much more magnified issue in the city. So there are poor people in small towns. There are homeless people in small towns, but you don't notice that scale of thing because there's not the magnitude that's there. And finally, stratification. You go out to the countryside, and these are people who have grown up with each other generationally. One of the first churches I served at, there were people buried in the graveyard. Okay, so their church had a graveyard. Very few churches in Houston have graveyards. So that was new. But there were graves in there that predated the Revolutionary War. There were some people who were members of the church who had parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on, buried in the graveyard. So in an area like that, everybody looks like me, sounds like me, thinks like me, talks like me. Their parents have known my parents, their grandparents have known my grandparents. There's just these completely parallel lives we've lived. That's not the city. I mean, we're all in here from somewhere else. And everybody thinks, well, I'm talking about the international folks in here. No, if you're a white person, chances are you've grown up somewhere else. I can probably count on one hand the number of what I call pure Houstonians, people who were born here, raised here, in more than just themselves, like their parents were also. There are very few people that I know in Houston. I moved in from somewhere. My wife moved in from somewhere. That's how we met each other. Is we both moved in from other places to Houston. So there's now this stratification where you could look at it economically. You have the haves and the have-nots. You could look at it linguistically. You have English speakers and you have all these other languages. You could look at it religiously. There's all these different religious layers. And so it's almost like an onion with these different layers that you peel through, which obviously makes it hard. I mean, when we design a program or an outreach event or whatever, who do we design it for? I mean, if we put it in English, that means we're only going to reach a certain generation. If we put it in another language, that means we're going to reach a certain other generation of people who have come here. And so this creates a huge challenge as we think through what is a ministry that reaches across generation, across gender, across economic scale, across ethnicity and language group. It's a huge challenge. And so the gospel, in places where it's kind of taken root and you've seen mass movements happen, this is why some theorists have actually developed this as this is an ought. We ought to do it this way, which I think we can recognize that it happens this way some. So there's something called the homogeneous unit principle, which is basically the gospel flows most quickly through people that are of like background. Now, I think if we look historically, that's certainly how it has happened in many instances. But I don't think we should turn that into a here's how you ought to do it kind of thing. So what are the opportunities then? I don't want to just bum you out and let you go. So here are some of the opportunities. Cities are where the people are. If there's a new movement in mission circles today to do what's called creation care. And people have a lot of opinions about it, but one comment I like to make to people is that humans are part of creation. So if you care about creation care, people have to be part of your view of creation care. Creation care cannot just be about plants and animals. It has to also include humanity, which I think that's where the creation care folks can get off, is that they have a very limited view of what is creation. But cities are where people are living. So if ministry is about reaching the people, you've got to go to the city. It's just that simple. And so the cities do attract in all of these people. If you think about 100 years ago in our country or 200 years ago in our country, if we wanted to see the gospel move through our country, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of miles on horseback to one guy's ranch, and then to another guy's ranch, and then to another guy's ranch, and then to a little village-sized town of 500 or 600 people. Well, now I could spend my life in Houston and probably not even scratch the surface. There's so many people and there's so many different pockets, both socioeconomically and religiously and linguistically. High density creates opportunities. So as there is this growing density, there is the ability for the gospel to spread faster. Also, people are mixing. So I mentioned the homogeneous unit principle, but people are choosing to mix on their own. So in a city like Houston, in a business like Houston, probably most of the people you work with are from various backgrounds. And so because of this, people have gotten used to hanging out in groups of folks that are not like them, which means I don't have to know every Vietnamese person in the city to be able to start sharing the gospel and to see it go through the Vietnamese population. I could just know a couple of them and they're connected. I don't have to know every person from Mexico or from, just pick the country. I don't have to know every single person. I don't have to find the whole pocket because whoever is connected to me is connected to them. Cities bring freedom, reinvention, and receptivity. People are moving to the city to embrace something new and something different, some kind of change. Typically, the front end of that is economic. But in order to make the economics work, they're forced out of their normal cultural pattern. Okay, so maybe you're from a really conservative country in the Middle East where you think women shouldn't be in the workforce. And then you come to the United States for work and you realize there's a lot of women in the workforce. So your desire to make money forces you to open up to some kind of change, some degree of change, in order for you to make that money, but it also creates this sense of openness where, okay, maybe my strongly held presupposition about men and women in the workforce isn't quite reality. But as people come to the city, this sense of openness allows them to reinvent who they are. You grow up in a small town, everybody remembers who you are. You do something dumb in high school in a small town, that lives with you. And the only way to get rid of that is to move towns. And then once you move to towns, once you go to the big state college or you move to another city, it's gone. Now, the internet is helping us, maintain that point of connection with our shameful pasts and embarrassing things. But in the city, people they don't have to be who they were. They can become someone new through, economic achievement, education, whatever. And all of this leads to receptivity. So in a place where you might get shot for coming on someone's land, in the city, we're just kind of up close and personal with lots of people all the time. That's actually, in my opinion, one of the frustrating things about a city like Houston is our city is almost designed to keep people apart. And so I went to school in Portland, and everywhere you went in Portland, you were kind of mashed up with people. They have a great, fantastic public transportation system. You can hop off at their airport and get anywhere in the city in a relative short amount of time with very little money and very well organized. So everywhere you go in Portland, people are kind of put together in different scenarios. And if that becomes your norm and then you come to a city like Houston, we all ride in our own individual car, we park in our own spot, we pull into our driveway, in our garage, in our own individual house. There's all this individualism which gets magnified down here. But people being thrown together in cities creates this sense of some degree of receptivity. Number 4, the nations are moving to the city. I don't need to preach that or beat that drum here. This is something that's obviously impacted us. But this is a great opportunity that we can meet people from around the world and do ministry to people around the world without having to go to some very hard to reach places. We can be right here, right now, and do things together. But the reverse is also true. So people are coming to the city, but the city is also going to the world. So via technology, things are getting exported. I mentioned that cities are like megaphones, and they magnify things going outward. And so if you have a city that is redeemed, Scripture talks about the city being set on the hill. And there is this opportunity to magnify the message of Christ. Also, people who come to the city often aren't tied to that place in the sense that you might be tied to generational family land. And so for most of us, you could live in your neighborhood, or you could look at the neighborhood across your region of Houston and move over there. We don't typically feel a strong sense of, well, I have to live in this exact spot. There is this sense of people in the city are on the move. In fact, a lot of people come to Houston, stay for 2-3 years, and wind up getting transferred out to another place. And so all of these things, there's a chance that if we impact people, if we grab them while they're here, there's this opportunity to impact places that we might never go. Cities are the engine of culture. Lots of culture change. People talk about impacting culture like it's this thing that's out there in the atmosphere. Oh man, we're going to impact culture. The only way you impact culture is by impacting people, because culture only exists where people exist. Kill all the people in the world, there's no more culture. I mean, there might be cultural artifacts. You might be able to go to an empty city and go, oh, look at the bridges they built, look at the buildings they built. We might still be able to discern, but that's archaeology, that's not culture. Culture exists where people exist. If you want to impact culture, you have to go to the people. You can't phone this kind of change in. It has to be something that it's very personal, it's very up close. One of my favorite urban missiologists, his name is Ray Bakke. I'm going to talk about him in a second, but he has this quote. He says, as the city becomes larger, our witness must become more personal. And I think what you see with a lot of churches is the reverse happens, where the city gets larger and larger, and there's this panic of, oh my gosh, how will we reach everybody? Let's do mailers. How many of you get mailers around Easter cantatas and Christmas stuff? How many of you read them carefully? Okay, I don't even really check our mailbox. I might check it once a month if I just happen to be standing out there when the mail person passes. If you know me, you're going to email it or text it or some other venue. You're not going to send me a letter. But cities are this place where there's this, because we feel kind of depersonalized from people, we can also make the gospel message impersonal. And Ray Bakke would say, no. In the city, the larger the city gets, the more personal this needs to become. It needs to be a very close personal interaction. And finally, cities are a place to meet human needs. If you cared about poverty and you lived by yourself on a ranch, this would just be a great theoretical idea. If you care about poverty and you live in a city like Houston, there are tons and tons of places and many opportunities every single day to help out people that are in need. If you care about immigration, if you care about, name any social issue, if you live out by yourself, it's all just strong feelings you have. If you live in the city, you have a place to exercise this gift and calling. So I want to close with what Ray Bakke says on urban ministry, and he talks about ministry specialization, and he's advocating for these things. So he says, in urban ministry, we need people who will work with at-risk peoples and communities. So at-risk people and communities could be things like people in poverty, homelessness, people who are trafficked, high school dropouts, drug addicts, orphans, single mothers. All of these people are fitting a pattern where the system itself is not naturally designed to take care of itself. This is the darker side of the city, is that it can become a much more mechanistic place where, here's the system and you get in the system or we have nothing for you. And this is the challenge of addressing things like homelessness, is many of the programs that you can refer people to aren't always suited to those people. And so there is a need for us in the church to focus religiously on at-risk peoples and communities. Second, there is the ministry specialization of working with multi-ethnic and multilingual peoples and communities. Again, obviously, no need to beat that drum here. This is something we do on a week-to-week basis. This also fits under that thing of challenges, right? Every ministry we have, I think most of our ministries now are having a bilingual effect, but we're having a bilingual effect in a city with 150 languages. Praise God that we've got a strong Spanish ministry, but what if you spoke, name the other language that's not English and Spanish? It would be a struggle. It would be a real struggle to help you in a significant way here. So there is a need for this level of specialization. In the same way that we send people to the field and we make them learn a language so that they can get involved, maybe we need to put this idea in our children's minds of you need to learn a second language so that you can live in a city like Houston or any major city and do ministry and help someone that would otherwise not be able to be reached. And then my favorite of his points is the work of all Christians in the marketplace. This is something that we don't talk enough about in Baptist circles. But there's a need for people who are in business to see the business world as a place to make an impact for the gospel. One, to live out a godly, ethical life has value in and of itself. Two, to do the work. If you're a garbage man, take out the garbage. That is a good and God-ordained service to our community. Because imagine, again, if for a moment garbage services stopped, all of a sudden the city becomes unlivable. And so each of these services, we might not think of them as this is a religious thing. If I want to serve God, I need to quit this job and go into ministry. No, the reality is that God uses every good and redeemable job position for his kingdom. But then number three is, this is where the nations are, this is where the people are. They're not knocking down the door to our church. They are knocking down the door to all of your businesses because they need to work, they need to make a living. And so if you have a job somewhere, that's where God has you, and there's a need for you to see your workplace is your place of ministry. So that's what he has to say on specialization. He has 5 theses about urban ministry. Number 1, urban ministry is cross-cultural. That seems pretty obvious to us now, but if you read some of the early urban missiology books, they might have one chapter on, by the way, cities are becoming really international places, and so if you're going to have a church there, you need to think about what are you going to do with ethnic minorities. Now, the new city books that are being written are written about, let's talk about reaching all the nations of the world. By the way, this happens to be in the city. And so that whole, horse and cart has been reversed in terms of how missiologists are talking about it. Number 2, we need to conduct a gospel and culture inventory. What is culture in our lives? What is gospel in our lives? What are those cultural things that we are putting ahead of the gospel that is preventing us from being able to share the gospel? I always assume my cultural pattern is right, but it's often just my cultural pattern. But if I get confused between the difference between my culture and the gospel, that has devastating effects for the gospel. It's the same as if I confuse politics and the gospel. You know, if you think that your main job is to convince people to vote for your candidate, and that's what God's put you in this city for, you're doing great harm to the gospel. I'm not saying you shouldn't vote. Go out and vote. I'm not even saying you shouldn't share your political ideas with people. But we do have to figure out what is culture, what is politics, what is whatever, and then what is the gospel. Because oftentimes those cultural things will prevent us from being effective in the city. Number 3, I guess this is kind of just pointed at me or the pastoral staff, but he says the image of the pastor has to change. He says the image of the pastor in traditional or smaller churches is he's the counselor, he's the teacher, he's the educator, and in the urban world, pastors have to be missiologists. I would lower that bar and say it's not just pastors. I think we as Christians in today's world, in the urban world, again, this is being written, back in the late 80s. But if you were to write this today, I think Baki would agree that everybody in the church, especially in a church like ours, has to be a missiologist. This is why in these afternoon classes we focus so much on culture and understanding other people's culture. It's not just a job for me and Jonathan and Beth and everybody who stands up publicly and does something. It's all of us. As people sit down in our homes or we sit down in their homes, we have to be able to understand what are these different cultural patterns. As we organize new Bible studies or a different program or a mission trip, we have to understand what are these cultural differences wherein people will participate or will not. Number 4, identify the real barriers. He argues that the barriers to effective urban ministry are not the city. They're the church. They're inside the walls of the church. It's our mindset of how we see things. Now, part of that is how are we, employing our own cultural paradigms rather than, the gospel. But most of the barriers to effective urban ministry, and I think I agree with him, are inside the walls, not the city. We always go, oh, there's so much crime in the city, and there's so much this in the city and that in the city. But the reality is there's a mindset shift that we have to change inside the church in order to be used in the world. The gospel's effective. It's never lost its effectivity. It's us who create social constructs that almost hide it or bury it or only share it with ourselves. That is what creates the barrier to the gospel getting out into the city. And then finally, Jesus is not Oprah. He had some other lady's name, but this was 1989 or so, and I have no clue who she was. But I picked up from context that she was some kind of social entrepreneur or something. And so I'll just use Oprah. She's got a lot more name recognition, but not back then. And so basically what he says is what we have is news, not advice. We have the good news. Not that we should never engage in holistic ministry thinking. Holistic ministry thinking would be thinking about not just the gospel, but also thinking about someone's lifestyle. So we'd never want to, start a soup kitchen that didn't include the gospel. But if someone's hungry and we give them the gospel and don't invite them to table with us, we're missing something either way. So he's not an advocate for let's only focus on the gospel and not do social ministry. However, we do have to understand that the real change that can come to our city, that we can bring, that's not being brought in by someone else, is the gospel. And so Jesus is not Oprah. All right, does anybody have any questions about all of that? Or comments? You might have seen something I missed. All right, so next week we're going to have Jonathan. He's going to share about homelessness, and we're going to have a testimony about the same topic from Charlene. And so you're not going to want to miss next Sunday. It's going to be really good, and I think going to help us understand the issue a lot more. I think there's so many issues that we're faced. There's kind of this bombarding of ideas that hits us every day, and it's just from every angle, right? Everybody's got some, and they're all really great ministries. Or really important problems. And sometimes it's overwhelming where you almost, to just cope, you just kind of close your ears and, look down at the concrete as you go to not have to see all these issues. And I think it's important for us to pause and take a closer look and a closer listen to, what can we do? What should we do? What is our obligation? Let me close this in a word of prayer. Lord, we thank you for today. We thank you for this lesson. God, open our eyes to our city. Show us how you have placed us here. Give us a sense of call to where you have us, whether we're in a school, whether we're just living in a neighborhood, to the people in our place of work, to the people we stop in and grab a cup of coffee from every day. Help us begin to see that, just like for Jonah, that there's 120,000 people and much cattle, and you care about it. We look by, we look past, look over these things all the time, but these are things that you care strongly about. And so, God, we just pray that as we've grown callous, or as we've grown busy, or as we've bought into attitudes from our culture, that you would just break these things out of us, root them out of us. Give us fresh eyes to see the city as you see it, to see the problems in the city as you see it. It's always easy to walk past it and kind of have that bystander effect where we feel like it's not our problem, or maybe we think we don't have the resources to deal with these various things, and yet you've placed us here. And we know that you have all wisdom, all knowledge, all resources. So God, we just pray that you would give us obedient hearts to fulfill your mission right where we live. We ask this in your name. Amen.